Welcome to On the Other Hand. I read stuff from NPR to try and keep my news intake balanced, but their double standards and biases drive me crazy. Let me show you what I mean. A while ago, NPR put out an article titled, "Outrage is a Business Model, How Ben Shapiro is Using Facebook to Build an Empire." You might say, so what? NPR was critical of a successful right-wing outlet. For comparison, a few years back, NPR did an interview with Vice, a left-leaning outlet. But instead of writing a hit piece, they wrote a puff piece on how successful Vice was. Now, NPR can do whatever articles on whomever they choose, but some consistency would be nice. NPR has also put out several articles on right-wing extremists, which is totally worthwhile, assuming of course one can trust NPR's assessment of who is an extremist. I don't like extremists as much as the next guy, but if you search for NPR left-wing extremists, the most relevant hit is, fact check, is left-wing violence rising? Surprise, surprise, they say no. And the other NPR articles that mention left-wing extremism do so only in response to how much less frequent it is compared to right-wing extremism, with no mention of the 2020 riots, of course. I've also seen the condemnation NPR has thrown at the Proud Boys, who I'm also not a fan of. And since the Proud Boys tout themselves as a group that pushes back against Antifa, I did a search to see what kind of coverage NPR gives to them. And the relevant articles had titles such as, "In many ways, Antifa eludes definition. What is it exactly?" A look at Antifa, and Antifa supporter on how people misunderstand the movement. Now, NPR does some good reporting, all things considered. I just wish I had to consider their biases a little less. Another example of bias is when Biden's son wrote a book, NPR did a book review and discussed its contents. But when Trump's son wrote a book, NPR had an article talking about the criteria of making it onto the bestseller list. Would hate to humanize Trump Jr., because that might affect how people see Trump. And speaking of Trump, back in October right before the Virginia governor's race that was seen as a bellwether election, NPR put out this article, "Virginia's race for governor is a test for Democrats and Trump's staying power." Both Trump and Biden endorsed their respective parties' candidates, but the funny part is Biden showed up in person to rally for the Democratic candidate and Trump did not. In fact, the Republican candidate specifically didn't closely associate with Trump, yet the article frames the story as Democrats versus Trump, when a far more accurate headline would be Republicans versus Biden. If these were isolated incidences of differing treatment, that's one thing, but I've yet to see an NPR article that has shown bias in favor of conservative positions, the pro-life stance, Trump, gun rights, or even my own religion at the local level. In fact, one of the worst parts of NPR is their omissions. Take this article, "Gun violence is killing more children. The pandemic may be playing a role," where it says, "The increase clearly coincides with the pandemic, but the causes are debatable. One hypothesis, more guns in homes." But that is the only hypothesis this article considers. But saying something like, "Another hypothesis is the correlation with the defund the police movement." But no, saying that would go against the message. And we can't have that. Rioting and looting have nothing to do with increased shootings. Anti-police sentiment and prosecutions aren't even worth considering. It's definitely COVID, guys. COVID makes more people shoot other people. When it comes down to it, whether NPR is projecting modern gender theory onto an ancient warrior with a genetic disorder, talking about how cringe it is to not use the term Latinx, openly saying their own journalists can be activists so long as they think it won't affect their own work, or adding a disclaimer to the literal Declaration of Independence, I wish NPR would act more like the impartial news outlet it purports to be, instead of the biased and taxpayer-subsidized outlet it actually is. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing or joining me on Odyssey, a great YouTube alternative. Link is in the description.